I keep saying nothing happened. I repeat it like a fact, like a shield. There was no kiss, no touch, no moment I can point to. But my thoughts didn't stay where they were supposed to. I replay conversations that never crossed a line. I remember looks that lasted a second too long. I tell myself this shouldn't matter, yet it follows me into quiet moments, and that's what scares me. I'm a woman in a stable relationship. The kind people assume is safe and settled. We share routines, plans, and a future that looks solid from the outside. I wasn't looking for excitement, attention, or an escape. I didn't wake up one day wanting to complicate my life. But something small shifted, quietly, and I didn't stop it in time. Nothing happened, and yet, something did, inside me. If you've ever struggled with guilt over thoughts you never acted on, I want to hear your perspective. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this kind of real, honest story resonates with you, subscribe and share it with someone who might need it. I didn't notice the shift right away. That's the part that bothers me most when I replay everything now. There was no dramatic moment, no clear warning sign. It started quietly, in a way that felt harmless enough to ignore. It was a normal stretch of life. Work, responsibilities, routines that blur into each other. My relationship wasn't falling apart. We weren't fighting. There was no betrayal waiting in the background. If anything, things felt steady, predictable, safe. And I wasn't unhappy in the obvious way people expect when they talk about temptation. I wasn't planning an exit. I wasn't looking for validation. I wasn't scrolling for attention or flirting with strangers. I genuinely believed I was grounded in who I was and what I had. Then this person entered my days in a way that didn't demand space. It just slowly took it. At first, it was nothing more than conversation. Casual, situational, easy. The kind of talk you don't think twice about repeating to your partner later because it feels neutral. We talked about work, stress, small frustrations, things adults talk about when they're tired and trying to get through the day. What changed wasn't what was said. It was how aware I became of saying it. I started noticing when I would pause before responding, choosing my words more carefully than necessary. I noticed how quickly I responded compared to other people. I noticed how my mood shifted slightly after those interactions. Not dramatically, just enough to register if I paid attention. And I didn't. I told myself it was normal to enjoy being understood. I told myself it was harmless to feel seen for a moment. I told myself connection didn't automatically mean intention. But somewhere in that logic, I stopped asking myself an important question. Why did this matter so much to me? There were moments when nothing happened at all. No message, no conversation. And I still found myself thinking about what I would say next time. Replaying past exchanges in my head, not because they were inappropriate, but because they felt unfinished, charged in a way I couldn't quite name without admitting something uncomfortable. I never crossed a physical line. I never made a plan. I never said anything explicit. But I let myself imagine what it would feel like if I did. And once I noticed that, it was already too late to pretend I was untouched by it. That's when the guilt started to creep in. Not loud, not dramatic, but persistent, like a quiet pressure reminding me that even if nothing happened, something was changing inside me, something I didn't know how to explain or undo. And I still didn't stop. Was I already crossing a line by letting those thoughts stay? What would you have done in my place at that point? Once I admitted to myself that something had shifted, I thought awareness would fix it. That's what I always believed. That naming a problem was the same as solving it. I told myself that now that I knew what was happening, I would naturally pull back, create distance, recenter myself. But awareness didn't bring distance. It brought tension. Every interaction after that felt heavier, more deliberate. I became hyper-aware of things that had once passed unnoticed. Tone, timing, silence. I started measuring moments instead of living them. And the worst part was that I didn't actually remove myself from the situation. I stayed right where I was, just more alert, and more curious. I didn't tell anyone, not my partner, not a friend, not even myself in a way that demanded action. I carried it quietly, convincing myself that silence was a form of control. that as long as everything stayed inside my head, no real damage could occur. But silence has a way of growing things. I found myself justifying small choices that didn't look like choices at all. Staying a little longer in conversations, letting pauses stretch instead of ending them, responding when I could have waited. None of it felt wrong enough to stop. Each moment stood alone, harmless on its own, or so I told myself. What scared me was how normal it all felt. There was no rush of adrenaline, no dramatic guilt at first. It was subtle, comfortable, like slipping into a version of myself that required less effort. I didn't feel like I was betraying anyone. I felt like I was being honest in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. And that's when the internal conflict sharpened, because I loved my partner. Truly. Our life together wasn't fake or fragile. We had history, trust, routines built over time. I wasn't unhappy with him. I was unsettled with myself, and that distinction mattered to me, because it allowed me to keep going without feeling like a villain. I started drawing invisible lines only I could see. I told myself, as long as I don't say this, as long as I don't ask that, as long as I don't let it go further. But every line I drew existed only after I'd already approached it. I noticed how often I thought about how things could shift with one different decision. One sentence phrased differently. One moment of honesty instead of restraint. I didn't want to act on it, but I wanted to know what it would feel like if I did. And wanting that scared me more than any action would have, because wanting meant I was changing. Quietly, gradually, without anyone else noticing. And the more I told myself I was in control, the more I realized control wasn't the same as choosing to stop. I wasn't asking if this was wrong anymore. I was asking how far I could go without it becoming wrong. And that question alone made me wonder if I'd already crossed a line I couldn't uncross. At this point, was I still being responsible, or just careful enough to avoid consequences? Do you think intention matters as much as action here? The first place it showed wasn't in what I said. It was in what I stopped saying. I didn't suddenly become distant or cold. If anything, I tried harder. I was more attentive, more present, more careful with my partner. On the surface, it probably looked like effort, like commitment, like someone choosing their relationship. But underneath that effort, something felt off. I started filtering myself in ways I hadn't before. Not because my partner was unsafe or judgmental, but because certain thoughts no longer felt innocent once I acknowledged where they were coming from. I caught myself hesitating before sharing small details about my day. Nothing important, nothing incriminating, just moments I didn't want to explain too deeply. And that hesitation mattered. I told myself I was protecting the relationship, that there was no reason to create tension over something that hadn't happened. Why confuse him with feelings I hadn't acted on? Why risk hurting someone over thoughts that might fade on their own? That logic made sense. It also created distance. I became more aware of my phone than usual. Not in an obvious, secretive way. Just enough that I noticed it myself. I would angle the screen slightly away, silence notifications faster than normal. Nothing dramatic, nothing suspicious on its own. But added together, it formed a pattern I didn't like recognizing. The guilt didn't explode. It settled in. It showed up in quiet moments, like when we were sitting together doing nothing in particular, when he talked about plans or something trivial, and I found myself nodding while my mind drifted elsewhere. I hated that about myself. I hated how easily my attention slipped. And what hurt the most was that he hadn't changed. He was the same person he'd always been, consistent, open, trusting. There was no crack in him that justified what was happening in me. I couldn't point to neglect or conflict or distance and say, this is why. There was no external reason strong enough to explain the internal shift. That made it harder to face, because if nothing was wrong with the relationship, then the problem had to be me. I started asking myself uncomfortable questions late at night, questions I avoided during the day because they demanded honesty I wasn't ready for. Was I bored? Was I craving something new? Was I afraid of how predictable my life had become? Or was I simply someone who liked attention more than I wanted to admit? None of the answers felt flattering. I realized I was comparing feelings instead of people. The stability of my relationship against the tension of possibility, safety against curiosity, reality against imagination. And imagination was winning, not because it was better, but because it hadn't been tested by real life yet. That scared me. I didn't want to be the kind of person who emotionally drifted while pretending nothing was happening. I didn't want to lie, not outright, not by omission. And yet, every day I didn't address it. That's exactly what I was doing. I was maintaining normalcy on the outside while negotiating with myself on the inside. The hardest part wasn't resisting action. It was carrying the awareness that I wanted something I couldn't justify wanting. And once I saw how that desire was quietly reshaping my behavior at home, I knew I couldn't keep pretending it was contained. Something would have to change. Either the situation or me. Should I have said something to my partner at this point, even if nothing had actually happened? Would honesty here have been responsible or cruel? The moment I couldn't ignore it anymore didn't come from desire. It came from fear. Not the fear of being caught, or exposed, or judged. It was the fear of realizing how easily I was adapting to this version of myself, how quickly something that once felt uncomfortable was starting to feel manageable. There was a day when nothing unusual happened at all. No conversation, no message, no interaction worth remembering. And yet, that night, lying next to my partner, I felt a heaviness I couldn't shake. It wasn't guilt in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter, more unsettling. The awareness that I was living two internal realities at once. One where I was present, committed, loving, and another where I was constantly negotiating restraint. I started asking myself what I was actually protecting. The relationship, or the version of myself that didn't have to make a hard choice yet. Because as long as nothing happened, I didn't have to decide who I was going to be. I noticed how much mental energy this was taking, how often I checked my own reactions, adjusted my tone, edited my thoughts before they could settle. It was exhausting, and that exhaustion began to bleed into other areas of my life. I was distracted, short-tempered, less patient than usual. My partner noticed something was off. Not the cause, but the effect. He asked if I was okay. Just that. Simple, genuine, the kind of question that usually opens the door to honesty. And for a split second, I almost told him everything. Not the details, just the truth that I was struggling with something I didn't fully understand yet. But I didn't. I smiled. I said I was tired. I blamed stress, work, life. All true enough to sound convincing, all vague enough to avoid the real conversation. And the moment passed. That's when I realized avoidance was becoming a choice, not just a reaction. I wasn't just managing thoughts anymore. I was actively protecting a secret, not because it involved actions, but because it involved desire. And protecting that secret required small compromises I kept telling myself didn't count. I asked myself if cutting contact would solve it, if distance would erase what had already settled in my mind. But even that felt like an admission I wasn't ready to make, because choosing distance meant acknowledging that something needed distance, and I wasn't sure I wanted to let go of what this feeling gave me. That realization shocked me, not because it meant I loved someone else. I didn't, but because it meant I valued the feeling itself, the awareness, the pull. The version of myself that felt awake in a way I hadn't noticed was missing. That's when the guilt sharpened into something clearer. I wasn't afraid of crossing a line. I was afraid of admitting I wanted to stand close enough to see it, and wanting that meant I couldn't stay neutral forever. Sooner or later, I would either step back, fully, or keep moving forward in ways I could no longer pretend were accidental. And for the first time, I understood that not choosing was also a choice. At this point, should I have forced distance, even if it meant confronting feelings I wasn't ready to name? Or was I already doing harm by staying exactly where I was? What changed next wasn't dramatic, and that's exactly why it scared me. There was no confrontation, no confession, no impulsive decision that forced everything into the open. Instead, the pressure I'd been carrying quietly started leaking into my behavior in ways I didn't immediately recognize as dangerous. I became more guarded without meaning to. Not closed off, just selective. I chose my words more carefully around my partner, not because I was hiding actions, but because I was hiding reactions. I didn't want him to notice how easily I was distracted, how often my mind drifted, how quickly my mood shifted depending on something as small as a message or a thought. That level of self-monitoring was new to me. I told myself I was being responsible, that managing myself was better than letting things spiral. But responsibility started to feel a lot like performance. I was acting the part of someone who had nothing to hide, instead of being someone who had nothing to hide. And that difference mattered. There were moments when I caught myself anticipating interactions I didn't want to admit I was anticipating. Not planning them, just waiting for them in a way that made time feel slower. I hated that feeling. I hated how much power it had over me without ever asking permission. I tried to counterbalance it by leaning harder into my relationship. More affection, more attention, more effort. And for a while, that worked. Not because it fixed anything, but because it distracted me. Until it didn't. One evening, my partner asked a simple question about my day. Nothing loaded, nothing suspicious, and I froze for just a second longer than normal. Long enough to feel it. Long enough to know that hesitation wasn't invisible, even if he didn't comment on it. That moment stayed with me. Because it showed me something I hadn't wanted to admit yet. This wasn't contained anymore. Not fully. What was happening inside me was starting to shape how I moved through the world, how I responded, how I showed up. And once that line blurs, it doesn't matter that nothing happened. The impact is already there. I started wondering how much truth a relationship actually needs to survive. Whether honesty is about facts alone, or about the internal shifts that slowly change us before anything visible occurs. I didn't know the answer. I only knew that I was standing in a space where silence felt safer than truth. And that scared me more than the temptation itself, because silence creates its own consequences. I wasn't proud of how comfortable I was becoming withholding, not lying, but editing, choosing what version of myself my partner got to see. And once I noticed that pattern, I couldn't unsee it. That's when I realized the risk wasn't just about crossing a line with someone else. The real risk was becoming someone I wouldn't recognize if this continued, and the worst part was that I still hadn't decided to stop. Was I protecting my relationship, or protecting myself from having to face an uncomfortable truth? At this stage, do you think silence is still a form of loyalty? Avoidance has a cost, even when it looks calm from the outside. At first, I thought the cost was just emotional fatigue, the constant monitoring of myself, the quiet tension, the mental edits. But as days passed, I realized it was deeper than that. It was reshaping how I experienced my own life. I wasn't present in moments that mattered anymore. Not because I didn't care, but because part of me was always elsewhere. Watching, anticipating, measuring. Even joy felt diluted. Laughter came easily, but it didn't settle. Affection felt sincere, but it didn't fully land. Everything had a thin layer of distraction over it. And that layer was made of thoughts I refused to confront directly. I noticed how often I replayed interactions in my head. Not just recent ones, but imagined future ones. Not explicit scenarios, not fantasies in the obvious sense, but possibilities, conversations that could tilt one way or another. Moments where I wondered what would happen if I stopped being so careful. I hated how familiar that internal space was becoming. The guilt shifted too. It wasn't sharp anymore. It wasn't loud. It was structural. It sat underneath everything, like background noise you don't notice until it stops. Except mine never did. It followed me through mundane tasks, through quiet evenings, through moments when I should have felt at peace. I started asking myself harder questions, the kind that don't have comforting answers. Was I staying silent because I cared about my partner's feelings? Or because I was afraid of losing the stability he represented? Was I holding on to this unresolved desire because it meant something real? Or because it gave me a sense of identity I didn't know I'd been missing? Those questions scared me because they didn't point outward, they pointed inward. I realized how tempting it was to frame this as something happening to me, instead of something I was actively participating in. It was easier to say I was confused than to admit I was choosing delay over clarity. That postponement felt safer than any decisive move. But safety started to feel dishonest. There was one night, lying awake next to my partner, listening to his breathing, when the weight of it all pressed down on me harder than before. I looked at him and felt a rush of affection, Real, grounded, familiar, and right behind it came something darker, the knowledge that I was withholding a part of myself, even if that part was messy and unresolved. I wasn't cheating, but I wasn't fully honest either, and living in that in-between space began to feel like a slow erosion of trust. Not his trust in me, but my trust in myself. I wondered how long I could keep this up without something breaking. Not exploding, not collapsing, just quietly weakening. Relationships don't always end in dramatic moments. Sometimes they end in subtle shifts that go unaddressed until they've done their damage. What unsettled me most was realizing that if nothing forced my hand, I might continue exactly like this. Careful, controlled, half-present, convincing myself that restraint was the same as integrity, and that thought made me deeply uncomfortable. Because if I kept choosing comfort over honesty, even internally, then the eventual consequences wouldn't be accidental. They would be earned. I wasn't standing on the edge of a cliff anymore. I was standing in a room with no doors, pretending that staying still meant staying safe. At this stage, was I still being cautious? Or was I slowly betraying my relationship in a quieter way? Do you believe emotional honesty is required even when it risks everything? The point where inaction stopped feeling neutral came quietly, not with a mistake, but with clarity I didn't ask for. I began to see patterns in myself that I couldn't unsee anymore, not just in this situation, but in how I handled discomfort in general. How quickly I reached for delay instead of decision. How easily I convinced myself that time would soften things I refused to face directly. And this time wasn't helping. I noticed how much of my emotional energy was being spent managing rather than living, managing my reactions, managing my tone, managing what I shared and what I kept private. It was like running two parallel versions of myself, the one my partner saw, and the one constantly negotiating restraint behind the scenes. That split was exhausting. What made it worse was that nothing external was forcing me to change. No ultimatum, no discovery, no crisis, which meant that if something broke later, I wouldn't be able to blame circumstance. I would have to face the fact that I let it weaken slowly, by choice. I started wondering if part of the appeal of this unresolved tension was that it allowed me to avoid confronting something deeper, my fear of disruption, because as long as I stayed in this limbo, I didn't have to risk hurting anyone. Or so I told myself, but there's a difference between avoiding harm and avoiding responsibility. I thought about what honesty would actually look like. Not a dramatic confession, not unloading every thought I'd ever had, but a version of truth that acknowledged my internal struggle. And every time I imagined that conversation, I felt my chest tighten, not because I expected anger, but because I feared disappointment. Disappointment felt heavier than conflict. I realized I was protecting my partner from information that might change how he saw me, but I was also protecting myself from having to see myself clearly through his eyes, from having my ambiguity reflected back at me. And that scared me more than any temptation ever did. I began to understand that the real line I was circling wasn't between fidelity and betrayal. It was between avoidance and accountability, between staying comfortable in uncertainty and choosing to confront the truth of who I was becoming. I couldn't pretend anymore that nothing had changed, because something fundamental had shifted. My sense of integrity wasn't intact. Not shattered, not broken, but compromised. I felt it in small moments of hesitation, in the way I avoided certain topics, in the relief I felt when difficult conversations didn't happen. Relief shouldn't come from silence. And that's when I knew that if I didn't choose something soon, distance, honesty, or closure, the choice would be made for me. Not by another person, but by the accumulation of small, unresolved moments. Inaction had stopped being passive. It had become a direction. And the longer I stayed on it, the harder it would be to turn back without consequences. At this point, do you think responsibility means speaking up, even if it changes everything? Or is it sometimes better to carry discomfort alone to protect the relationship? The decision didn't arrive as a single moment of courage. It arrived as pressure from carrying too much internally without release, pressure from realizing that every version of doing nothing was quietly shaping the outcome anyway. I had spent so long telling myself I was being careful that I hadn't noticed how much carelessness that required toward my own values. I began to understand something uncomfortable. There was no clean way out anymore. Every option in front of me came with loss attached to it. If I spoke honestly, even carefully, even without details, I risked destabilizing a relationship built on trust and consistency. I risked planting doubt where there hadn't been any. I risked changing how my partner saw me, not because of what I had done, but because of what I had allowed myself to want. If I created distance quietly, pulling back, reducing contact, forcing space, I would still be making a choice without explanation, one that might protect the relationship on the surface, but leave a residue inside me. Distance might cool the desire, but it wouldn't erase the fact that it had existed, or what it had revealed about me. And if I did nothing, if I stayed exactly where I was, I already knew the cost of that path. It meant continuing to live divided. It meant normalizing half-truths. It meant slowly adjusting my moral compass to fit my comfort instead of my values. None of those outcomes felt neutral anymore. What scared me most wasn't that I might lose something. It was that I might keep everything and lose myself in the process. I started paying attention to how often I justified my silence with concern for others, how often I framed my avoidance as kindness, as protection, as maturity. But underneath that framing, there was fear of confrontation, fear of being seen clearly, fear of admitting that I wasn't as unaffected, as steady, as self-aware as I liked to believe. I realized that I had been treating integrity like something flexible, something that could bend temporarily without breaking. But integrity doesn't announce when it's eroding. It just feels heavier to carry. There were moments when I almost hoped for an external trigger, something that would force my hand so I wouldn't have to choose deliberately, a question asked too directly, a situation that made denial impossible. I hated that part of myself, the part that wished for circumstances to decide for me, because wanting that meant I didn't trust myself to do the right thing without pressure. I started replaying earlier versions of myself in my mind, who I was before this tension existed, before I learned how easily desire could coexist with loyalty, how quietly temptation could grow without ever crossing a visible line. I missed the simplicity of believing that intention was obvious and character was fixed. Now I knew better. I knew that character is revealed in moments where nothing forces you to act, when the only witness is yourself. That realization didn't bring clarity. It brought responsibility. I understood that no matter what I chose next, I would have to live with the knowledge that I had stood here, aware, and decided what kind of person I was willing to be. There was no version of this where I stayed innocent, only versions where I stayed honest, or didn't. And that made the weight of the decision feel real in a way it hadn't before, because suddenly, this wasn't just about desire, or guilt, or temptation. It was about alignment, about whether my internal world matched the life I was claiming to live. And once I framed it that way, I knew I couldn't keep postponing the answer much longer. Something had to give. At this point, do you think integrity means choosing the option that hurts now, or the one that prevents greater damage later? Which path would you take if every choice cost something? I didn't act because I felt brave. I acted because staying still finally felt dishonest. There's a moment when indecision stops feeling like caution and starts feeling like avoidance so obvious you can't excuse it anymore. For me, that moment didn't come with clarity or relief. It came with a quiet exhaustion, the kind that settles into your bones after carrying something too heavy for too long. I realized I was no longer asking myself what is the right thing to do. I was asking how much longer can I keep living like this without becoming someone I don't respect. That shift mattered, because once the question changes, the answer does too. I stopped pretending that time would resolve this on its own. Time had already done its part. It had exposed the truth. Not about anyone else, but about me. About how easily I could rationalize, how comfortable I could become with half-honesty, how convincing my internal arguments sounded when no one challenged them. I understood then that waiting wasn't neutral. It was a decision I was making every day. So I chose to interrupt the pattern. Not dramatically, not impulsively. I didn't confess everything. I didn't unload every thought I'd ever had. I didn't seek absolution or reassurance. What I did was smaller, and somehow heavier. I created distance, real distance. I stopped engaging in the spaces where this tension lived. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain it. I didn't frame it as sacrifice or virtue. I simply removed myself from the proximity that had allowed desire to grow unchecked. And that choice hurt more than I expected, because distance doesn't just remove temptation. It removes the version of yourself that felt awake in that space. It exposes how much meaning you were attaching to something unresolved. It forces you to sit with the absence, and with what that absence reveals, I felt grief, and that confused me. Not grief for a person, but for a possibility, for a version of myself I had briefly touched, and now had to let go of deliberately. That loss didn't feel noble. It felt personal, quiet, unseen. At the same time, I felt relief, not the clean kind, not the kind that feels like closure, but the kind that comes from no longer lying to yourself. The mental noise softened, the constant monitoring eased. I could breathe again without calculating what I was suppressing, but relief came with consequences too. I noticed how much I had been carrying alone, and how that weight had shaped my behavior at home. I became more present, genuinely present. Not because I was trying to compensate, but because I finally had all of myself available again. And that contrast was uncomfortable, because it forced me to confront how divided I had been before, how much my partner had trusted me without knowing the internal struggle I was managing. That trust felt heavier now, not lighter. I still didn't tell him everything, and that choice stayed with me. I questioned it constantly. Was distance enough? Was silence still a form of protection? Or had it become a new kind of dishonesty? I didn't know. I only knew that I had finally chosen a direction that aligned more closely with the person I wanted to be, even if it cost me something I hadn't expected to mourn. What surprised me most was how unsatisfying the resolution felt. There was no sense of victory, no moral high ground, no clean ending, just a quiet understanding that doing the right thing doesn't always feel good. And doing something late doesn't erase the fact that you waited too long to do it. I hadn't crossed a visible line, but I had come close enough to see how fragile my boundaries really were, and that knowledge didn't disappear when the temptation did. It stayed. It changed how I saw myself. It changed how carefully I treated my choices. It changed how seriously I took the space between intention and action, because now I knew how quickly that space can collapse if you stop paying attention. Do you think choosing distance without full honesty is a form of integrity? Or just another way to avoid accountability? At this point, did I do enough? Or did I wait too long? The hardest part didn't end when I created distance. In many ways, that's when it actually began. Because once the noise quieted, once the pull weakened, I was left alone with myself, not distracted by tension, not negotiating restraint, not hiding behind nothing happened. Just me and the aftermath of choices made slowly, quietly, without witnesses. Distance solved the urgency. It didn't solve the questions. I started noticing how differently I moved through my days, how much lighter my mind felt without constant self-surveillance. But with that lightness came clarity, and clarity can be uncomfortable when it shows you who you were while you were justifying yourself. I couldn't pretend anymore that this had been harmless. No one got hurt directly. No trust was broken openly. No rules were crossed in a way that could be proven. And yet, something had been tested. I realized that I had learned more about my limits in this quiet struggle than I ever had in moments of obvious conflict. I learned how easily I could convince myself that intention didn't matter, as long as action didn't follow. How tempting it was to measure morality by outcomes, instead of by alignment. That realization stayed with me. I looked at my partner differently, not with guilt alone, but with responsibility. He had trusted me fully, without suspicion, without control, and I had lived inside that trust, while managing a private conflict he never agreed to be part of. That truth didn't feel like betrayal in the dramatic sense. It felt heavier than that. Because betrayal, at least, is clear. This was quiet erosion. I asked myself again whether I should tell him, not because something was still happening, but because something had happened internally. Because honesty isn't only about facts. It's about whether the person you love is sharing life with the version of you that actually exists. I still don't know if full disclosure would have been healing or destructive. I know that telling him would have transferred my burden onto him. I also know that not telling him means I carry it alone. Neither option feels clean. Neither one feels heroic. They just feel human. What I do know is this: I don't see myself the same way anymore. Not in a broken way. In a more cautious way. I no longer believe that character is defined only by what we do when someone is watching. I believe it's shaped in moments where restraint is invisible and justification is easy, where no one forces you to choose. And yet every day you are choosing something. I learned that wanting something you shouldn't doesn't make you a villain, but refusing to look honestly at that wanting, pretending it means nothing, can quietly change who you are. I didn't lose my relationship. I didn't pursue the temptation. I didn't come out of this with a clean conscience either. What I came out with was awareness. Awareness of how fragile boundaries can be. Awareness of how powerful silence is. Awareness that doing nothing is often doing more than we admit. And maybe that's the real consequence. Not punishment, not loss, but the permanent knowledge of what you're capable of. I'm still with my partner. I'm present. I'm committed. But I carry this as a reminder, not a secret I'm proud of. A reminder that integrity isn't proven by avoiding disaster, but by how seriously we take the moments that almost become one. Do you think I made the right choice in the end? If you enjoy real, thought-provoking Reddit-style stories, subscribe to the channel for more.